Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you coming back after the lunch in such a nice and sunny day. So thank you very much for coming. We are going to start the session soon. This is a very interesting talk. This is about keeping us secure in the digital world. So Carla is a security engineer in Striper, and she's going to talk to us about how we can be more secure in a digital world. So the stage is all yours, Carla.
Hello, everyone. As we said, thanks so much for coming back after lunch. I know this can kind of be like a nap period, so if you just tune in and out, that's fine. But hopefully I'm pretty high energy and I'll keep us all nice and engaged. And so I wanted to talk today about two-factor authentication. And this isn't going to be a talk where I tell you to use two-factor authentication. I generally think you should, but it's not always going to be the right trade-off for everyone. Instead, I'm going to talk about two-factor authentication in the real world, when it's being used by real people and what sorts of usability trade-offs are involved there. But I wanted to start with a story. And it's my story. It starts when I was in university. And I had a friend at the time who ran an online learning site that I had an account on. And this site stored passwords in a way that was pretty secure, so it's hashing them, it's salting them, it's not storing them in plain text. But one day this friend and I were chatting, and we were talking about password security, and I said, you know, my password is like a word, a number, a word, and then a special character. And my friend was starting to get interested in security, and he took this as a challenge. So he went off and he generated every possible password that could possibly be based on a dictionary. And then he ran all of those passwords against his site and figured out which ones could be valid for me. And it worked. He managed to find a password that, if entered on his site, would let someone log in with my account. But he really wanted to know if this was the password I used on other sites. So he tried it on my Facebook account. And it worked there as well. I'd shared the same password between this site and my Facebook account, and so my friend managed to log in. Unfortunately for him, I had login notifications turned on my Facebook account. So I was sitting at home one day, and I got an email saying, hey, someone new has logged into your account from this particular suburb of Sydney. It's not a suburb of Sydney that has any data centers in it. It's also a suburb of Sydney where I only have one friend. So we had a very awkward conversation over iMessage at the time. But it still felt really uncomfortable, right? My friend was like, I haven't done anything bad on your account. I haven't changed anything. I was just trying it out as a puzzle. But it still feels kind of dirty to have someone going through your online account without your permission. It's like having someone walk around your house when you're not home without you knowing. And this is actually a really common situation on the internet these days. It's something we call an account takeover, which is when someone other than the legitimate user of an account manages to log in and use it in the way that a legitimate user might. And we often think of this as happening because maybe your password is password123 or something, and they've brute forced it. But that's actually not how these accounts are usually compromised these days, because you can get around that sort of attack by just rate limiting on the side of the site, right? So most major sites, Facebook included, prevent people from trying lots of passwords for one account in a short time. Instead, what we usually see happen is a less secure site being compromised, having its passwords leaked, and then those are used on a more secure site. Now, this happened to me, and I thought, okay, what can I do to prevent this from happening again? So I went and looked online, and I found two main pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is to use a unique password on every site. And yeah, 100% that meant that this would not have happened to me. But there's been some research from a couple of different password manager companies that show that the average user has between 90 and 190 accounts online. It's not really practical to ask users to come up with 100 secrets and remember them, and make sure that they're all different. Up on the screen here, these are just some of the sites that have been compromised in the last 10 years in a way that would have required you to change your password, and that I personally have used. It's just not very realistic. The other piece of advice you'll find online is to use two-factor authentication. So let's stop and talk about that for a second. And we're going to do so in two stages. First of all, I'm going to explain the different types of 2FA and the trade-offs that are involved with each. And then I'm going to talk about how you can think about which type of 2FA is right for you, and maybe also for your friends and family. But let's start with what two-factor authentication even is in the first place. You've probably seen it before, at the very least on your bank, if not on other sites. If you try and log in on Google, you might see this. And essentially the way it works is you enter your email address and password, and then you get asked for another credential. Sometimes it's a text message to your phone, sometimes it's a push notification, sometimes it's a number generated on your phone or on another physical token. But in each case, it's important that this second factor is unique. It's got to be different to any other second factor, but also it needs to be independent from your password. So that means that it can't be a code sent to your email account, because I could reset your password using your email account as well. So there would be one place that I could compromise in order to get access to your account. But even if we rule email out, there's still like 4 different forms of 2FA that are in use today. And that's kind of a lot considering they're all different. They all have different security and usability trade-offs. So let's travel back in time a little bit and step through how we ended up at this point. How did we end up with so many different forms of 2FA? So we're going to go back to the early 2000s. Just as a reminder, denim is all the rage. Everyone has a Nokia 6610. And if you work at a bank, you have an RSA Secure ID token, this little device on the right-hand side. Now, this was actually the first broadly available 2FA device, and it was first released in 1986, and by 2003, 70% of the 2FA devices on the market were of this particular type. But it was really only used for bank employees until about the mid-2000s, and that's because of this graph. This is the number of data breaches per year for the last 15 years or so. Back in the early 2000s, data breaches just really weren't that much of a problem. But really the most interesting thing about this graph is that it starts in 2005. And that's because there is no information on the number of data breaches per year prior to that. No one was counting because they were so rare. The very first data breach where passwords were leaked only happened in 2004, and it was by an engineer intentionally selling that data to a marketer. There really just wasn't a large consumer need or demand for 2FA until much later on. And that meant that 2FA could have a much higher barrier to entry. These could be more expensive devices, and they could be a little bit harder to set up. And that's how we ended up with these Secure ID tokens. The way they work is you have the 6-digit code that's displayed on the screen, and it changes every minute or so. When you go to log in, you enter a password, and then you enter the 6-digit code. And banks started off using them because their passwords tended to be pins, so they're made up of numbers rather than alphabetic characters, which tends to make them less complex. And also they tend to be short, which makes them really easy to copy or shoulder surf off someone else. The way they actually work in an underlying sense is that there's a secret that's baked onto that token, and it's also got a clock on it. The server also knows the secret and knows the current time, and then we put both of those 2 inputs through an algorithm and come up with the 6-digit code. If the code you enter matches the code that the server thinks should be displayed on the device at the time, you're let in. And this was really great because it meant that even if users had the password 9876, that you couldn't log into their accounts because they would have this extra token. But there were some downsides. Users had a tendency to lose these devices. And that was a bit of a problem, but you worked at a bank, and so there was an IT department, and they could let you back in. But there's another really interesting way of cutting that data from before, and that's if we cut it by industry. And what you'll notice here is that back in the early to late 2000s, most of these data breaches were actually happening not just in the business sector, but also across education and government. And that's because these actually weren't breaches of password databases. They were breaches of identity. This is identity theft. So these are addresses being leaked, phone numbers being leaked. If you're in the United States, maybe your social security number. But it wasn't really password databases until later on, where we start to see that spike in business. And this is really epitomized in 2009 by the RockYou data breach. If you've ever seen any analysis on what a usual password looks like, what the most common passwords are, it's almost invariably based on this one particular breach. There was this company called RockYou. They made media widgets for your WordPress site. They also made the unfortunate choice to store their passwords in plain text. When they got hacked, someone thought it'd be a cool idea if they just released that entire database to everyone. And suddenly there were 30 million sets of email address and password credentials just lying around on the internet, which is how we ended up with all this analysis. In September 2010 and February 2011, Google actually added support for 2FA to Google Apps and Gmail. And it's really hard to see this as anything but a reaction to RockYou, given the exact timing that's involved here. But Google had 2 problems that banks did not have. The first one is that it wanted to incentivize its users. It couldn't just say they had to use 2FA because it needed to keep getting growth. And if they charged for 2FA devices, that wasn't really very incentivizing. But the other problem they had is that they're a global company. And so they needed to send these tokens to people all over the world, where it could be very expensive, and it wasn't really tractable to let people back in if they lost their tokens. So they decided to build a software version of the same thing. They have an app for this. It's still in use today. It's called Google Authenticator. You might have seen it before. And it looks a little bit like this. Still got the same 6-digit codes that we saw before. It's using a different algorithm, so now they change every 30 seconds rather than every minute. But fundamentally, same kind of idea. Secret, clock, keep them the same on the server. And now the secret is set up when you scan a QR code to start with. But otherwise, it's fundamentally the same. And they had this cool idea, which was, okay, well, it'd be really great if when you moved to a new phone, if you restored your old phone to your new phone, that those secrets kept lying around, kept staying on your phone, you didn't have to worry about it. But in 2011, Apple actually released iCloud, and they released support for iCloud backups. And this was really cool, right? Now you got a new phone, and you could download like a copy of your old phone from the internet. It was great. But the problem was, back in 2011, iCloud didn't have support for 2FA. And so now I'd try and log into your Google account. I'd get told that I needed to know your 2FA credentials. I'd be like, OK, go to iCloud, log into your iCloud account, and restore your phone to mine. And now I would have those secrets. And this is far from a hypothetical attack. We actually saw this happening a lot in 2014. There are a bunch of celebrity photo leaks that were attributed to this. And also North Korea theoretically hacked Sony for retribution for a movie. And that was also happening via iCloud. And the other problem Google had with this was that this really assumed that you had a smartphone, which back in 2011 wasn't really a given, right? A lot of people still had feature phones. And so they did something pretty novel. They added support for SMS 2FA. The principle here was that, OK, rather than generating a 6-digit code based on an algorithm, instead we'll just generate a completely random 6-digit code, store it on the server side, and send it to you. If you can tell us what we just sent you, you must control the phone. And that caught on really quickly at a bunch of different tech companies. Facebook added support just after Google launched this, and also WordPress and sort of AWS. And it worked really well for the average user. Maybe their password got compromised, but you probably didn't control their phone, and so like you'd text someone, and then they wouldn't be able to get back in, or they wouldn't be able to get in because the attacker wouldn't control that phone number. But compromising accounts is actually a really lucrative market. That's why it happens so much, right? If I can break into your account and steal a bunch of money, I'm going to do that because I can make money on it. And if you've ever talked to anyone who works at a fintech company, it's really hard to tell the difference between a good account that's suddenly traveling in a foreign country and a good account that has been compromised. And so attackers started to iterate. So let's take a step back and pretend that we're a high-value target. Back in 2011, this might mean that you're maybe a journalist reporting against a regime that doesn't have freedom of the press, or maybe you're a whistleblower for government corruption. These days, it's a little bit less altruistic. You might just own a bunch of cryptocurrency. And that kind of gets to the flaw in SMS 2FA, which is that it's not a message to your phone. It's a message to your phone number. But people lose their phones all the time, right? And they move telco companies all the time. And telcos don't want people to get stuck here. What this means is if you call up your telco and you say, my full name is this, my address is this, my date of birth is this, they'll let you move your phone number to a new SIM because they think that maybe you lost it or maybe you're moving carriers. But that data is not particularly secret these days. And so an attacker can do the same thing. And this is an attack called SIM porting or SIM swapping. Now, for the average user, this probably isn't going to happen. But if you have a lot of money in cryptocurrencies that are secured with 2FA, SMS 2FA, or if you're a target for other reasons, then yeah, I might choose to call your telco and try and do this. And so we had an idea, which was, OK, what if we could send an SMS, but to the actual phone rather than to the phone number, and just cut the telco out of the picture entirely? Well, at the time, many of these companies had proprietary apps. And so shipping support for this particular sort of push notification would be pretty easy. You just build it into the apps. So you send a push notification down. It's got a 6-digit code in it, same way as you would with SMS. And again, if the user can enter the same code, then they can log in. You're still going to have that iCloud problem, but we'll come back to that later. There's not really a standard for what this sort of 2FA looks like. This is what it looks like for Duo, where it's just a yes/no prompt. Some of the other different sorts of apps are like Microsoft Authenticator, which prompts you for like 3 different codes and asks you which one is currently showing up on the screen you're trying to log into. And some of them really are just generic push notifications. But this suffers from a problem that's kind of plagued the internet since the beginning of time, which is that humans are really fallible and they really like to help one another. On the left-hand side of the screen, that's the real legitimate GitHub login page. And on the right-hand side, that's a phishing page. It's really hard to tell the difference, even if you're looking. Even if you look at the URL, the right-hand one is actually hosted on GitHub Pages, so it's actually very difficult to tell. And nothing about any of the forms of 2FA we've talked about so far prevents this type of attack. If I can ask you for your password here, I can also ask you for a 2FA code. There's actually a lot of psychology that says that once you've entered your password, the odds that you will then not go on to enter your 2FA code are very low, because you're really committed to the belief that this is a legitimate page by this point in time. There are actually tools that will help you do this. There's a tool called EvilGenX, which is a reverse Nginx proxy, that will just go off and proxy any requests to a domain you control to some other site, and basically do this attack for you. If that's a little bit too technical for you, there's some research from the UC San Diego released earlier this year that actually says it only costs about $1 to $500 USD to ask for someone to perform this sort of attack on your behalf on a particular account. It's actually really cheap to hack someone's account if you're trying to, and you're doing it on the black market. So we thought, okay. How about if we removed humans from the loop entirely? We wanted it to be the case that even if someone was convinced to enter their 2FA code, that it actually couldn't be used on the legitimate site. So we came up with this idea of security keys. From a user experience perspective, you've got this little key that lives on your keychain. And when you want to log in, you plug it into the side of your computer and tap the gold button. And that's it, you're in. That's all you have to think about. There's no 6-digit codes. The way it actually works is very similar to those time-based algorithms we looked at earlier. There's the same token secret baked onto the device. Rather than a clock, there's a nonce, which is just like a random value sent from the server. It just means we don't need a battery on it. But most importantly, one of the inputs to the algorithm is the domain name of the page you're currently on. And this means that even if I convince you to tap your key on evil.com, the response you get, it won't be valid on the legitimate site because the domain was part of the input. And this means that even if a user can be tricked into tapping their key, you're all good, you're all safe. So those are the kinds of 2FA that are currently on the market. You might notice something quite interesting, which is that we've actually come full circle when it comes to cost. A decade ago, we tried really hard not to need specialized hardware for 2FA. Now we're back to needing specialized hardware, and it's a little bit cheaper. It's only 20 USD, but it's still not feasible for the vast majority of users. These keys are really hard to buy in Australia. I've tried. And so the problem is, like, even if you lose your phone or you lose any of these other forms of 2FA, normally you can call someone to let you back into your account. If you're using SMS 2FA, you can call your telco. And that's a problem from a security perspective, but it's also a solution from a usability perspective. And this is something we really don't talk about very much in the security community. We don't really talk about the usability impact of having 2FA turned on for your accounts. And it really gets to the human side of this problem, because there's really no point having 2FA turned on for a service if you never use it because it's too annoying. And so let's talk about the common reasons that people actually get locked out of their accounts in the first place. And by this, I mean that there's no way for them to get back in, short of talking to the service provider and out-of-band verifying their identity. So I mentioned losing your phone or losing your token. That's a problem for most of these forms of 2FA. And remember that iCloud issue I talked about before? Google solved that. They just don't back up your codes to the cloud. What this means is if you get a new phone in September and you're super excited and you restore a backup onto your new phone and wipe your old one, if you don't manually copy those codes across, you've lost access to your accounts in that process. That's also a problem for mobile apps if they're implemented in a more secure way. On the other hand, if you're using SMS 2FA and you maybe go to a foreign country and you don't have international roaming, kind of out of luck in terms of logging in, right? You don't have a lot of options. For security keys, you've got the loss problem as well, but you've also got the issue that it is kind of a USB device. There are NFC options. You can use it with an Android phone, and there's a Bluetooth option as well that exists for iPhones. But there's not a lot of manufacturers here, and there have been a lot of vulnerabilities in the wireless versions of these protocols. It's actually not currently possible to buy a Bluetooth key that works on an iPhone because of a vulnerability that came out 1 or 2 months ago. We really want to make the right choices here, but we've got to figure out a good way of trading off these usability and security differences. We really want a framework here that'll help us make the right choices, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. So it's a little bit hard to think about abstract risk. We're going to make it a little bit more familiar. A friend pays you back some money at work, and you need to walk to the bank to deposit it. Would you feel safe walking with, I don't know, maybe $20, $50 from work to a bank? Probably, right? You probably work in a fairly safe area of town. The bank's probably in a safe area of town. Doesn't seem like a big risk. But I have a friend who really likes to skydive, and he buys parachutes on basically Gumtree and ends up with thousands of dollars of cash that he needs to carry from work to the bank. Kind of changes the way you think about it when you say that there's a lot of money involved. Changes the way you think about it if I say that my friend does it in a sack with like a dollar sign written on the side of it. If I say that he's doing it at night, or if I say that he's doing it in an area that is known for crime. Maybe it's known for muggings. This sort of thing is like what we think about every day, right? We think about how to trade these risks off. We have a really fancy name for it in security. We call it threat modeling. It's just designed to make it a little bit harder to understand. But there's also things you might think about in this scenario. How could you mitigate the risk? My friend chose to do it by asking me to come along with him. The odds of you getting mugged are much lower with 2 people than with 1. If you're carrying a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars, you might pay a bodyguard to come along with you too, those little armor guard truck things that drive around. That's the sort of thing that you might think about to mitigate the risks involved here. And we should be doing the same sort of thing when we consider whether or not we should be using 2FA online and which forms we should be using. I want you to think about the area of the internet that you're operating in and whether or not it makes you a target. If your account handles a lot of money, and it would be a big issue if that money got stolen, you should be trying to use a more secure form of 2FA. On the other hand, if your account isn't super valuable, you can probably get away with using a less secure form of 2FA, or no 2FA at all if you're okay with the outcome there. Now, knowing about this modeling is really useful when it comes to our own personal choices. But the problem gets more complex when we think about our users or our family, because they don't know as much about the security trade-offs involved here. And those usability problems, they're more of an issue for them. It's like the difference between someone who knows that the bank is in an area that is known for crime and someone who doesn't know that. You might make different choices with that information. Now, the advice we give people here, it needs to take into account this sort of model of the world that they have. Maybe you do think it would be safest to have a bodyguard go with them to the bank, right? That's kind of like the using a security key version of 2FA. But if you know there's no way they would ever pay for a bodyguard, you're probably better off recommending that they take a friend with them, because that will make them more secure than advice that they'll never follow. This is the concept of harm reduction, right? Trying to reduce the amount of damage that's done, even if your new solution isn't perfect. SMS 2FA, it's the take a friend option of the 2FA world. It's not perfect, there are a lot of issues with it, but it's probably more secure than what most users or your friends and family are gonna go with, and it's probably what you should be recommending. So some key takeaways. If you're on a cryptocurrency site, you should be recommending that your users are using the most secure forms of 2FA. There's a lot of money involved. But any form of 2FA is better than nothing. And the right method for you isn't going to be the right method for everyone else. You need to think about how they're thinking about the world and the trade-offs. To wrap things up, we'll go back to that story I told at the beginning. My friend, after that extremely awkward conversation, did apologize. But I was still really angry at him for a long time. We ended up being friends in the long run. We both went on to work in security. He still likes breaking things. I kind of prefer fixing them. But most importantly, because my Facebook account got hacked, I went off and I learned all about this sort of thing. And now I work in a job trying to protect that from happening to other people, trying to protect other people from having to go through that negative experience. And that's all I had for you today. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks very much, Carla. I think I learned a lot. You made me more a friend and more secure. At the same time, we have time for a couple of questions.
I can paraphrase.
Thanks so much. That was an awesome talk. I was just wondering, is there any way, or do you know of any frameworks or anything that exist for comparing different authenticators? So, for example, a system that combines maybe passwords and biometrics compared to a system that has a password and a security key?
Yeah, so the question is about whether there's frameworks that you can use to evaluate maybe the difference between using a password and biometrics and a password and, say, a security key. Is that right?
Yeah.
Awesome. I don't actually know of any particular frameworks. I think people usually tend to reason about that sort of thing generally from first principles. Biometrics are particularly interesting because we often think of them as an authentication factor, but they can't be changed, right? So like if we start using fingerprints in place of like a 2FA device, and then your fingerprint data gets leaked, like you're gonna end up with a big problem because you can't change it. Same way we use like iris scans for some forms of security, but you can't change your iris once it's leaked as well, right? So there's this kind of problem with biometrics, which is we like to think of them as a third factor, but they're not the same as the other two because they can't be changed. And you leave them everywhere you go, right? My fingerprints are on everything I touch, right? My iris is anyone I interact with knows what it is. So I think generally the industry standard that I've seen is that like you shouldn't really use biometrics if it's for a secure application where it matters that you're able to roll those credentials, but I haven't actually seen any particular frameworks. Yes?
On that same note, facial recognition.
Yes.
So obviously, you know, phones having the facial recognition before you actually log in or allow you to access to your passwords.
Right, so the question's about facial recognition, and basically I think what I think about that, I'm guessing. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic because it's very much tied into this idea of usability, right? Facial recognition, Touch ID, any kind of fingerprint scanning, right? Again, those are credentials that you can't change, but you've got to think about like, what is the attack model you're thinking about when it comes to that, right? Like maybe someone is able to stand next to you and like tell you that you have to look at your phone. But if someone's able to stand next to you and tell you that, they can also probably ask you to enter your password, right? Like you're under so much duress there that like you're probably kind of screwed either way. And you should probably not be trying to defend your phone anymore. I think for something like a phone, it's probably fine because of exactly that sort of thing. If you're talking about like a really secure system, like I don't know, a medical facility or something, it starts to get a little bit different because it's like, well, again, your face is everywhere, right? And the security cameras all over the world. And so again, if you're working in like a defense facility or somewhere where it really matters, then I'd start to think twice about it. But you have to weigh off the other trade-offs as well, which is if someone's entering a PIN every time they enter a facility, do they remember to cover the PIN with their hand every time? Are there any cameras nearby? Do they tell their PIN to their friends because they forgot their own one, but their friend asked really nicely? You've got to think about like the actual world in which we're operating here. Because if you make it too onerous for someone to log in, then they'll just work around that system.
And
Yes.
You mentioned usability, so what's the statistics on having users that always have to put a PIN in? A little bit like Qantas does it, right?
Yep.
Get sent to your phone before they log in, and how does that change your users using your app?
Yeah, so this is about essentially, I think, like the
Customer journey.
Yeah, the customer journey, right? Like the hit to usability that you take if you force people to use 2FA.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's like a very real problem. I don't know of any stats that talk about this too much in the industry. Most companies are super cagey about this sort of thing. There are some really good studies from Dropbox on this sort of thing and also from Google. They've released some public studies that talk about how different forms of 2FA affect things. Mostly they focus more on how you can protect accounts rather than the usability hit, which I think is an unfortunate bias that exists in the industry. In my experience, it's kind of interesting. What we've actually seen is generally for newer accounts, people don't mind. If you ask someone to use 2FA from the very first time they sign up, then they kind of come to expect that they'll need that. But if you change your requirements at any point in time, people are like up in arms about the fact that they might need to like enter a code now. So I think a lot of it is also about expectation setting, right? If you tell someone at the start that they're going to need it, then you can maybe explain like, well, your Qantas account is very valuable because think of all those frequent flyer miles you have and how bad it would be if someone stole them and used them to fly, I don't know, to the States in first class, right? Once you start to tie it to like actual monetary incentives, it's often a little bit easier for users. But I think people have a really hard time with the usability trade-offs when they don't understand what it's really buying them, right? Like if you don't really understand why you have to enter the code, you're like, this is super annoying. Why can't I just do what I do everywhere else? And I think that's something that people are like still trying to learn, right? Like trying to explain it to like someone in my grandparents' generation, and it's like this uphill battle to explain why they need a secure password in the first place, right? It's all about user expectations, I think.
I think we don't have now time for the questions, so I'll ask you to take it offline during the break and see. Please join me to thank Carla for the wonderful. So now we start our second session of this afternoon. And we have Kerry, who is a PhD student in Monash, and is going to talk about a wonderful topic in terms of our caregivers keeping phone and not keeping phone, and then how do they take care of our children. So I'm very much interested in this topic personally and look forward to hear. So please join me to welcome Kerry.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming, much appreciated. So I'm Carrie, I'm a PhD student at Monash, and I'm talking about the impact of caregiver mobile device use on parent-child interactions. Monash, there's me. I'm a bit of an odd duck. I'm in the Faculty of Education. I think I'm the only representative from Monash here in the Faculty of Education, so there I am. Today, I'm just going to talk about some of the background literature surrounding this issue because it is quite a new topic that's coming to our attention. And then I'm going to talk about a study I've done as part of my PhD and the methodology I used to get there and what we found. So it probably won't come as a surprise to anyone in this room to learn that we are using our mobile devices more than ever. Parents have told us that they use their devices 5.8 hours a day on average. So that's a great deal if you think about that in terms of how often they're actually using it. What you might be surprised to know though is that almost 3/4 of parents actually use devices while they're with their children. So a lot of the time that was once spent just interacting with kids now involves a device. So we need to consider this monumental shift in parenting practices that's very, very new for our society. How is this changing the parent-child relationship? I'm having a look at that exact issue, and I'm doing it through the perspective of this model, and I've sort of put this together from prior research. So if we start off with the assumption that parents are using devices while they're with their kids, then we need to ask what is actually happening. So I'll have a look at that question in a minute, how are parents using it with their kids? But our model suggests that once that happens, there's one of two possible outcomes for interactions. The first is that parents are using devices instead of spending time with their kids. So where they might have been playing with them, now they're not doing that. They're looking at the device. So in that case, interactions are disappearing and being replaced by devices. The alternative is that parents are trying to do both. So they're trying to speak to their kids while they're using their phone. And because the device is dinging and ringing and it's quite all-encompassing, attention's going down to the device. So that still involves interactions, but it's leading to lower quality interactions than what we might have previously seen. Assuming this is correct, we then need to ask ourselves, what does all of these smaller lost interactions add up to? And I've used attachment theory as the basis of my PhD, and that's a very well-known theory from the 80s that suggests that parents and kids have a strong lifelong bond. And this bond is good, it has lots of important developmental benefits, educational benefits, great outcomes at school, even better partner relationships later in life, better friendships. So it's great. But in order to get there, we need lots of small parenting practices to go right. Lots of good things like responsivity that I'll go into in a minute. Once they go right, we have a nice lifelong bond. But we're suggesting if interactions are being lost or of lower quality, then this overall attachment relationship might be threatened in the long run, and that could have poor developmental outcomes. So just starting with that first pillar, how are parents actually using devices? We know that parents use devices most often during playtime and meal times. This is important because both of those things should be occurring every day, very frequent, and they involve a great deal of interaction. So playtime is great for parents and kids because it's a chance for parents to know what kids are thinking, understand their world a little bit more, understand the developmental level they're at, and get involved in that. Mealtimes are also excellent because of the language they produce. So we've got lots of stimulation around meals, we've got lots of things to discuss, we talk about our day. So they're both important developmentally, and we now know that device use is occurring during these times. That's likely to lead to developmental consequences. So let's have a look. Are interactions being displaced and are they of lower quality? So far, this is what we know, and a lot more research needs to be done into this area. It's only started as a field of research in 2014, so we don't know that much yet, and this all comes from the United States. Still, what we do know is a bit concerning. So we can see that there's 20% fewer verbal interactions when parents are using devices. There's even more non-verbal interactions, like smiles, eye contact, gestures, that sort of thing. We also know that when parents use devices, they're less responsive to their children than parents who don't. So when kids call out, they're not as aware of that. So we know that interactions are being lost, they are of lower quality. How could this work together to impact attachment as a whole? We know attachment, it's a lifelong bond between parents and children. Here are some of the key pillars that need to be met. So good parenting behaviours that lead to a secure attachment. That's on the left. Yes, on the left. Sorry, I don't know my left and my right, but other than that, I'm doing PhD. We're right. And here is the graph showing how these attachment behaviours are being threatened. So you can see they match up. If we take, for example, the top one, responsivity, so kids need parents to recognise what they want and need and respond to it quickly. So if they're crying, they need a parent to walk over and pick them up. We know, though, from prior research that parents are ignoring their child's calls to them. So they are less responsive than they used to be. So as a whole, all the pillars of attachment are coming under threat. Switching to something slightly different for a moment, rather than just negative, we have parents using devices alone. We also have an alternative, which is parents using devices with their children together. And this is being called joint media engagement. How often parents are doing this, we really don't know. We've had very varying rates coming out of studies. It might be that parents don't know themselves. What effect this has, we also don't really know. Our earlier research from this comes from televisions where parents and children co-viewed a show together. We know from that the quantity of language went down, but the quality went up because they were watching the show together and they had good prompts of things to talk about. So potentially, we could also have the same effect happening with mobile devices. We just don't really know yet, but it could be a positive benefit for attachment. So my motivation for doing my study was to understand a lot more about those smaller interactions. What kind of effect is this having? Also in particular, we've heard a lot about parents. What are they doing? How is that affecting things? We don't really know anything so far about how children respond. Maybe they take it well, maybe they don't. That could also change the effect on interaction because it's a dual relationship. So I set out to investigate these things, and I did it using an observational methodology. So I went into 5 shopping centres in Melbourne, into the food courts and into the playgrounds, and I observed parent-child dyads to see what was happening. There's some eligibility criteria there that you can see. Effectively, we picked the nearest playground or food court, the nearest dyad, and we watched them. They only counted to our data set if they were there for at least 10 minutes. That means I did 112 and only ended up with 68. Yay for data collection. What I saw, we wrote down with jottings, so everything was captured, and from there that became field notes which were analysed. So what did I find? Most importantly, I found that 80.9% of all the diabs I observed involved a parent using a device. So more than 3/4, more than even the prior research coming out of the US, although quite similar. That's a very, very high number. The vast majority of parents now use devices when they're with their kids. In terms of how parents were using it, we saw that most parents attempted to multitask. So they tried to balance their wish to use the device with their children's needs by looking down at the device and looking back up at their kid. So what prompted that? The number one reason was safety. So when something entered the playground that could have been a threat, we saw parents choose to multitask very quickly. That might have been like an older child who was doing something threatening, for example. Parents looked up really quickly, they craned their head to find their child, locked eye contact, and then made a choice. Should they go over and intervene, or should they stay where they are and continue with the device? The other main reason was for engagement. So devices are very all-encompassing. So while they were using their devices, they lost touch with what their child was doing. But they want to be there for their kids, so they looked up and tried to re-engage. And this happened in one of 2 ways. One was trying to build on what the kid was already doing. So if they were on a slide, for example, they tried to support or scaffold that to make it more fun by saying something like, "Wow, you slid down really fast, good job." The other we can all identify with was needing to give an instruction. So if they saw the child doing something out of the corner of their eye, like walking out of the playground, they looked up really quickly and said, "Stop, sit back down." So they engaged with kids in one of those 2 ways. As long as multitasking was a theme, the opposite was also true with absorption, with parents who didn't really look up often at all. And we saw 6 of the total number of observations where parents did not look up at any point throughout the observation, remained entirely focused on the device. And the longest for that was 34 minutes, which was a long time for a small child. Sometimes parents went through periods of absorption. So something happened like a text conversation or an email or a phone call where it needed all their attention right now on the device. And that's what they did. But when that moment finished, they went back to the child. So it could occur in one of 2 ways. Having a look at how kids responded, across the vast, vast majority of observations, at least at one point of device use, children responded by just continuing what they were doing, eating or playing or something like that. So usually they continued at only one point. You might think that that's a good thing because kids aren't bothered. The alternative might be true that perhaps they're so used to parents using devices, they don't even try to engage their parents. Depends on how you see that. 5 kids continued throughout the entire observation, so they didn't attempt to engage their parents at any point either. Of course, we saw much of the opposite as well. So across most observations, children tried to grab their parents' attention at least at one point, usually by walking up to a parent or calling out, "Mom, mom, mom, mom." And sometimes they didn't get a reply. And when this happened, we saw most kids start to elevate their attempts. So across 6 observations, they called out at least 5 times, or they dragged the play equipment, like if it was like a drum or a teddy bear or something, up to their parent to make their point really clear, "Play with me." A Across 4 observations, that continue to elevate again to become attention-seeking behaviour. And you can see some examples up there. So in the last one, I saw a 3-year-old boy whose dad was on the device in the playground, and the 3-year-old reached up and was trying to grab the device while his father was battering his hand away. What effect did we find it had on interactions? The biggest theme here was missed interactions. It did have a very significant impact. So when parents were using devices, they were less likely to join in children's play. And you can see when they were using devices, they joined in only 25% of the time. When they weren't using devices, they joined in 46% of the time. So some big differences there. We also saw lots of parents who ignored their kids and weren't responding to them trying to catch their attention. So you can see the statistical difference up there as well. Perhaps most alarmingly though, we saw the risk of children being injured in the playground start to elevate when parents were using devices. So we didn't see this a lot, it was only across 4 observations, but there was an example of a 1-year-old and she was standing up in the pram pushing herself away from the table. Mum didn't look up or notice because she was on the device, and she pushed until she was angled like that, and then she fell over into the pram onto her head. And she cried and screamed, and then Mum looked up. But she missed that. So the girl fell in the pram, but she could have fallen out of it. Another theme we saw was negative interactions. So once that device is there and it's very consuming and very appealing, parents didn't necessarily want to look back up and engage with the child. And when the child was trying to get their attention, we saw them becoming annoyed and impatient across 5 observations. 4 of them involving device use and 1 by comparison that didn't. And some of those negative interactions was yelling, some of it was quite disappointing and difficult to hear. We saw in some cases a father saying to his son, "If you don't go back and play, we're leaving right now." So some of them were quite negative. On a positive side, we had a look at joint media engagement as well. When we looked at mobile devices, we didn't see very much of this. It only occurred across 4 observations. Interestingly though, and this is a theme we weren't looking for, but we saw some co-use of fixed devices. So one food court and one shopping centre had large game boards that were sort of quite large. They were fixed over in the corner and kids could go over and play like word games and card games or something on them. They were only one food court, one shopping centre. However, when they were there, they were quite popular. So we saw parents choosing to go over and play with their kids on those across 7 observations, which are only in one food court, so that's quite a high number. How kids responded to this joint use was interesting. When parents gave them a mobile device and used it with them, kids actually weren't that interested in the parent, although they were very interested in the device. They took physical assistance from the parent, so they enjoyed the parent holding it for them or pushing the buttons at their direction. They wanted that, but they didn't need technical help. And they weren't very interested in their parent trying to engage it with them. Sometimes if parents tried to say, "Oh, should we play?" the kids went, "No." So they weren't that interested. With the shared boards though, we saw something different happen. Perhaps because they were larger, they involved word games with reading and skills they didn't have, kids were much more interested in parental input. We saw joint attention where they both looked at the boards, they were smiling and laughing together, and parents were actively helping. So an interesting possibility there, although we weren't looking for it. In the future, we've got some interesting results here. We can see that parental device use does appear to lead to less interactions, and they are lower quality in that they could become negative, risk of injuries going up, those sort of things. However, this was an observational study, which is great. Qualitative research is fantastic, but we do need to pull this apart a little bit more and drill down into this issue. So we're going to be trying to use an experimental methodology in a lab where we can record and compare parents who use devices against those who don't, and then we'll see what we can find out about quantity and quality of language and things like that. Something else that would be fantastic to research further is joint media engagement and better understand what impact that's actually having and why parents might choose to use larger boards, but why aren't they using mobile devices with their kids? So that would be good if we could do that into the future as well. Some recommendations do come out of this. This is always a tricky part, if you're a parent in particular, because it does appear to be less interaction when you use the device. Wherever possible, trying to limit that device use around kids is probably a good idea, particularly at those key interactional opportunities. Playing in playgrounds, meal times, they do have developmental benefits, so trying to limit that is great. We've also got involving kids in joint media engagement because there's more language, shared attention, positive things coming out of it. Rather than maybe using devices alone, try and see if you can play a game or something with a child. For us as IT researchers, I suppose, what we can do might involve changing some of the way apps are designed, perhaps to make them to be played with a parent, or if it's a parent with a child. So two-player games where parents can play one character and child can play another, and they can come together. Or looking at how maybe we can turn tables into interactive touch tables so play can happen on a bigger surface. We've also got another opportunity there for guidelines. I don't know if you know, but the American Academy of Pediatrics produces screen use guidelines for children, and they suggest a maximum amount of screen use for kids. But we don't have any guidelines around adults, and yet we know that 3/4 of adults or more are using devices. So perhaps parents themselves need more suggestions, what apps they should use, how they should use it well, how to limit it. All those sort of things can be helpful for parents as well. In conclusion, we now know device use is very common, very, very common. When kids see their parents using it, they often continue with the activity at some point, but usually they'll start to try to get parents' attention, and that can escalate. The big takeaway here is parental device use does reduce interactions. They play with their kids less often, they're less responsive, we have less language. What else? We don't know, but hopefully we can find out. Ultimately, of course, it can lead to some negative interactions, and it could even compromise safety. But let's hope for the joint media engagement train. Let's go there. And then lastly, just contact me if you want to talk about it. I'd love to hear from you. I'm not there. Thank you.
Thanks for the wonderful talk, and it's so great to listen. Adults should also have some distinctions. We have a question time for a couple of questions. First you, and then
I just want to know what age group of children you were looking at.
Yep. In my study, observationally, it was anyone who appeared to be under the age of 18, because we just wanted. Having said that, the oldest child we had was 13, and they were almost all under 5. Because playgrounds, you don't usually see 18-year-olds on the monkey bars. So they were all quite little.
I just wanted to say, as someone who's a parent of young kids, that was actually really hard to listen to. And it was, and I think people need to be more aware of these things, because it's almost like, it's almost like an addiction, and the aggression and anger, and it's not, even just leave me alone, it's not meant to be, but it's that's the kind of behaviour that comes from an addiction, and I think this information needs to get out there to parents, because, I am so anti screens for my kids, but for me it's a different, different thing,
Yeah.
and that was just really shocking, so thank you for bringing me forward.
Thank you.
I'm interested in the age demographic of the parents. I'm Gen X, but I tend to, as a parent, I have a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old. I kind of have kids a bit late, and I observe younger generations of mums, new mums just with that phone there, and I sort of think, well, my generation, we didn't grow up with devices, so, and I'm just wondering if there's sort of more of a predilection for Gen Y versus Gen X, older, younger versus their parents and their engagement with the devices. Because yes, I'm guilty of all the things you've said, but then I've also had someone ask, an old man thought I was the grandparent of one of my kids.
Oh.
And I looked at him and said, why? And he said, just because you put your phone down, you weren't on your phone and you were, talking to your daughter.
Yeah.
I thought you were the grandparent.
Oh.
So I took the compliment about the age thing.
Good attitude. Well, because we saw mostly young kids in playgrounds, we saw younger parents as well. You know, if whatever age group of parents normally have kids around that 4, 5-year-old sort of age group. So we didn't see a lot of difference, but we didn't see a lot of older parents. Not really young, all the way up to 35, I would sort of say, you know, top 30s. We didn't see much difference in there, but I can't say we saw older parents, and there's not really prior research there. I'd love to know too.
I think I suggest to take the discussion offline. Please,
Thank you.